All right, this is the second FRQ question on our first macro review test. And it reads as follows. Assume the economy of Andersonland is in a long-run equilibrium with full employment. In the short run, nominal wages are fixed. Part A wants us to draw a graph of short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, labeling equilibrium output and price level. All right, so we need to start with our standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. We know how to do this. Real simple, ASAD. And remember that the axes on an aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph are the price level in the economy as a whole on the y-axis, and real GDP on the x-axis, or the amount of output. Now, equilibrium is taking place right here, where the two curves meet. Right here is the equilibrium price level we'll call PL1, and it wants us to label output as Y1. So that's our equilibrium price and output. But so far, we've only posted the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves. There's one other curve that it wants us to put on this graph, and that's the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, if you remember from class, long-run aggregate supply is equal to potential GDP. And what is potential GDP? It is the amount of GDP, or the amount of output, that we would be producing if we were at full employment in the economy. If all of our workers were employed, we would produce a certain amount of goods and services in the economy. That amount is potential GDP and is also long-run aggregate supply. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to be a vertical, straight up and down curve somewhere at some value of real GDP on the x-axis. Now that curve can be placed in one of three positions in relationship to our equilibrium point. Remember, our equilibrium point is right here where the curves cross. That curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve, could either be to the left of that dot, to the right of that dot, or run straight through the center of that dot, that equilibrium point. If the curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve, is to the left of the dot, so let me put this in a different color to distinguish it. If it's to the left of the dot, that means that potential GDP, or long-run aggregate supply, is at this value right here. But our current level of output, Y1, is above that potential GDP value. So our economy is currently producing more than it's capable of at full employment. And remember that full employment doesn't mean literally every single person is employed. It means that the unemployment rate is the natural rate of unemployment. But it is possible in the short run that our unemployment rate could drop below the natural rate of unemployment. So we would not only have zero cyclical unemployment, we would also be eating into some of the frictional and structural unemployment. That's not sustainable long term, but it can happen in the short run economic cycles. And if that's happening, we are producing more GDP than our potential GDP, and the distance between this curve right here, the red curve, and the equilibrium point would be called an inflationary gap. Okay, now, the curve could also be, let me give another color, to the right of our equilibrium value. If potential GDP is over here to the right of our equilibrium output, then our equilibrium output is less than potential GDP, or the long-run aggregate supply curve. When that is the case, we are experiencing what's called a recessionary gap. That's the distance between the equilibrium point and the potential GDP curve. That's a recessionary gap. That means that we are experiencing a high level of unemployment. Our unemployment rate is above the natural rate of unemployment. We have cyclical unemployment in this economy. And so we're not producing as much as we could be, so we're in a recession. Okay, that's two of the three types of equilibriums that can occur. When it can occur above or below the potential GDP line. But our problem specifically states that our economy is at full employment right now. So the unemployment rate is not below the natural rate of unemployment, and it's not above it. It is equal to it. When we are at full employment, the unemployment rate is the natural rate of unemployment. So if our economy is currently producing at full employment, that means we are producing right at potential GDP. Because remember, potential GDP shows us how much we can produce at the natural rate of unemployment. If our current Y1 value is equivalent to potential GDP, or long-run aggregate supply, and the long-run aggregate supply curve comes straight up right here through the middle of that equilibrium point. That is called a full employment equilibrium. So you should have drawn an equilibrium with a long-run aggregate supply curve going straight through the middle of the equilibrium point. You should not have put the red or the green line. It would have been straight through. All right, that's the first part. That's part A. Now, on part B, we need to assume that there's an increase in exports from Anderson Land. And we need to show the effect that these additional exports will have on our equilibrium price and output in the short run, and relabel our graph. I'm actually going to reproduce the graph just so it doesn't get too involved down here. I'm going to reproduce it down here. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, price level, GDP, and currently we are at full employment equilibrium, so the long run aggregate supply is coming straight through our equilibrium point. So part B says there are, we'll go ahead and label this part B, there are higher exports in the economy. Now, what does that mean? That means that countries around the world are wanting to purchase our goods. They are demanding our goods. And so we are shipping more of our goods overseas. So if exports increase, what's going to happen to this graph that we've got on the board? Well, remember, aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, and net exports is equal to exports minus imports. Exports minus imports. Now, because exports, this E right here, is a positive value, if it increases, then by definition, just by doing this equation, aggregate demand must increase as well. So an increase in exports will boost aggregate demand, and we will experience a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. A rightward shift. When we get a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, we will hit a new equilibrium point. It'll be where AD1 crosses the aggregate supply curve, and that's going to happen right here. Right here. That's our new equilibrium point, and it wants us to label the output level as Y2, and the price level as PL2. PL2. That's our new equilibrium point because of the higher exports. All right, now part C says, based on the answer from part B, what is the impact of these higher exports on real wages in the short run? Actually, to see this, we've got to do a couple of things. First, we need to remember what real wages are. Nominal wages is the value of our wage as it is actually given to us. What do I mean by that? If you agree to work at a fast food joint to receive $8 an hour, $8 an hour is your nominal wage. It's what you actually receive. In theory, they are supposed to hand you $8 bills. Now, you probably get an electronic check or something like that, but you physically get $8 for your work. It's your nominal wage. Real wage is an attempt at measuring what that nominal wage you receive is actually worth given what the prices in the economy are. How much can that wage actually buy you? So, for example, if I offer you 2 different jobs in 2 different countries. In country A, you're going to receive $20 an hour. But in country B, you're only going to receive $10 an hour. Which would you choose? Well, naturally, you're inclined to say, I want the $20 an hour. But what if I told you that in country A, price levels in the economy had skyrocketed, and inflation was up 300%. And so now your $20 an hour barely is enough to buy you lunch, because the lunch you would buy and every other thing in the economy is so expensive. But in country B, where you're only making $10 an hour, prices are incredibly low. And $10 is actually enough to buy you a full tank of gas. Now you'd prefer to work in country B and make $10 an hour, because that $10 can buy you more stuff in that country than $20 an hour in another country can. So the value of your wage is completely dependent upon how much it can buy you, and that's dependent upon what the prices of everything else in the economy are. So the real wage is an adjustment of your nominal wage to account for inflation and price levels in the economy. So with all that in mind, let's go back to part C and figure out what is the impact of these exports on our real wages. Well, notice that we showed in this graph right here in part B that aggregate demand shifts to the right. And when aggregate demand shifts to the right, what happens to the price level in the economy? It rises. Remember, our old equilibrium price level before the exports increased was right here. Then we had a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right. We hit a new equilibrium point, and our price level, our equilibrium price level, rose from PL1 to PL2. Prices in the economy have gone up. Now, if prices in the economy go up, what happens to your real wage? It's going to drop, because that same amount that you receive per hour, $8 an hour, $10 an hour, whatever it is, now buys you less stuff, because everything you want to go out and buy is more expensive. Why is everything you want to buy more expensive? Because price levels in the economy have risen. We went from PL1 to PL2. Remember, as a note, the problem stated that nominal wages are fixed, meaning that just because the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right does not mean that the wage you get per hour increases. So before the exports went up, you were making $10 an hour, just for example, and after the exports go up, you're still just making $10 an hour. Your wages have not increased. What has increased is the price of everything in the economy. And so you're making the same amount, aka nominal wages are fixed, and yet you can't buy as much with the amount of wages that you're making. So your real wage, what your money can really buy you, has decreased. So the answer to part C is real wages drop. Does it want an explanation? Yes, it does. Because real wages have dropped because prices increased. Prices went up. Okay? So that's part C. Part D then says, as a result of the increase in exports, export-oriented industries in Anderson Land increase expenditures on new containers and shipping equipment. So there's two parts to it. What component of aggregate demand will change? Well, this is just sort of a definition thing. If you've got businesses that are geared toward exporting things in Anderson Land, and they're buying a bunch of shipping containers and equipment, what is it that they're buying? They're buying capital. And remember, what's capital? Capital is oftentimes the machines, the equipment, the physical, durable goods that a business needs in order to conduct its business. This could be machines for a manufacturing firm like Ford. Ford's auto-producing machines are capital. Or it can also be something that's not a machine that makes other stuff, like a car or something. A car can be capital if you're a taxi service. The taxi, the car, is the physical good that you use to do your business and to generate revenues. You're not selling the taxi, just like Ford is not selling its robot producing cars, but it does need those things in order to produce what it will sell. And so, when Anderson Land's industries, export-oriented industries, purchase new containers and shipping equipment, they're purchasing capital. Well, when businesses buy capital, what is that called? That's called investment. Businesses are investing by purchasing capital. So what component of aggregate demand will change? Capital will change. I'm sorry, I spoke there. Investment will change. Investment increases. So what is the impact on long-run aggregate supply as a result of this increase in investment? Remember, what was long-run aggregate supply from the first part? It's the same as potential GDP. And what is potential GDP? The amount that we are able to produce. Well, if all the businesses, or at least a large portion of businesses in the economy, are increasing the amount of capital that they have, and capital is what they use to produce goods and services, if they've got more capital, they can produce more goods and services. And if the amount of goods and services that businesses in our country can produce is increasing for each business, then the amount we can produce as a whole in the economy is increasing. And so our potential GDP is increasing. The amount we can produce as a whole is increasing because we've got more tools, machines, whatever, to help us produce more stuff. And so potential GDP is going to shift to the right. And since potential GDP and the long-run aggregate supply curve are the same, then long-run aggregate supply is going to increase. Let me illustrate. It didn't ask us to do a graph, but let me just graph this real quick. Remember, this is our long-run aggregate supply curve slash potential GDP curve. So if we have more capital in the economy, businesses can produce more, the amount we can potentially produce increases, so our potential GDP slash long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. It's going to move outward. So to state that in words, what is the impact on long-run aggregate supply? Long-run aggregate supply increases. Increases because capital has increased. All right, that's it for that question.